In a storm triggered by Japan PM Sanae Takaichi's unprecedented remarks on the so-called Taiwan contingency, Washington calmly stepped back, while Tokyo expected a standing ovation. It was December 19, 2025. Washington was cold, Congress was tired, everyone was pretending to work hard before the holidays, and U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio stepped up to the podium for his year-end press briefing. Now, normally, these things are about as exciting as airport security announcements. Climate, humanitarian aid, a few polite jabs at adversaries, everyone nods, reporters type, life goes on. But this one was different. This one landed like a cold shower in Tokyo. Because buried inside Rubio's calm, measured, diplomat-approved answers was a chilly message Japan didn't really want to hear. Yes, we're allies. And yes, we're still talking to China. But listen, we're not taking your side the way you hoped. And just like that, Washington quietly rewrote the mood music of East Asia, without raising its voice even once. To understand why Rubio's remarks mattered so much, we have to rewind about 6 weeks, to November 7, 2025, and a moment in Japan's parliament that set off a chain reaction no one in Tokyo seemed fully prepared for. Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi, answering questions in the Diet, touched the most sensitive geopolitical nerve in Asia, Taiwan. She suggested that if China were to attack Taiwan, Japan might consider that scenario a survival-threatening situation. In other words, something serious enough to trigger Japan's right to collective self-defense. In short, Japan is prepared to fight with China for Taiwan. Now, that might sound like normal alliance talk if you're used to NATO briefings or Pentagon press releases, where bullshits fly but nobody cares. But in Japan, it was explosive. For decades, Japan has lived behind a carefully constructed wall of ambiguity about Taiwan. Its constitution limits military action. Its leaders traditionally speak in code. And when it comes to Taiwan, a red line for Beijing, Tokyo usually tiptoes, whispers, and beats the bushes. Takaichi didn't whisper. She didn't tiptoe. She said it out loud, not bothering to beat the grass. And Beijing heard every word. Beijing wants Sanae Takaichi to take back every word. Sanae Takaichi refused to retreat, despite worsening ties with Beijing. From China's perspective, Takaichi's remarks weren't just careless, they were unacceptable. Taiwan isn't an international, or a regional issue in Beijing's eyes. No hypothetical scenario, or abstract security concern, should deny the fact that Taiwan is China's own domestic affairs. It's a core sovereignty issue for China. One of the very few topics that trigger instant, emotional, and institutional backlash across China's entire political system. When the domestic Taiwan issue is tied to the militarist Japan, the Chinese people are getting angry, not just Beijing's diplomats. So, when Japan's prime minister openly linked Taiwan to Japan's national survival, Beijing responded exactly as expected, then harder and harsher. Diplomatic protests in harsh language. Warnings about playing with fire. Explicit reminders of Japan's wartime history. China made it clear, it wasn't a misunderstanding, not a slip of tongue. It was a line crossed. She is not supposed to go away with consequences. And while China didn't want escalation, it absolutely wanted correction, specifically, a retraction that never came. Inside Japan, the reaction was far from unified. Some conservative voices applauded Takaichi for speaking honestly and facing reality. They argued that Taiwan's contingency is inseparable from Japan's security, both geographically and strategically, and that it is also economically intertwined with Japan. But others were alarmed. Opposition politicians criticized the prime minister for acting bluntly on what they described as the most dangerous issue imaginable. Scholars warned that Japan was abandoning decades of carefully managed ambiguity. Civic groups worried Japan was being dragged into a confrontation it neither controls nor can afford. And then things escalated further because politics always finds a way to get worse if not addressed promptly and properly. Reports emerged that a senior security advisor close to the prime minister suggested Japan should consider nuclear weapons. Japan, the only country ever attacked with atomic bombs, suddenly found itself debating nuclear deterrence again. The backlash was immediate and fierce. The government rushed to reaffirm its three non-nuclear principles. Opposition leaders demanded accountability. Public trust wobbled. At this point, Tokyo wasn't just dealing with Beijing anymore. It was dealing with itself. Sanae Takaichi is a strong lady at home when facing her husband. She is the wife of Taku Yamamoto. They divorced and then remarried. In their unique arrangement, Yamamoto even took Sanae Takaichi's surname upon remarriage, a less common move under Japanese naming conventions, which require spouses to share a family name. Taku Yamamoto, now rebranded as Taku Takaichi, has described himself as a supportive, stealth husband who stays largely out of the spotlight so his wife can focus on her career. Now his wife is not just under the spotlight, but in the spotlight, not because of his obscurity, but for her own stunt. As she angered another man. Chinese President Xi Jinping does not tolerate her, perhaps because his wife is 100 times better. He does not care what she thinks and demands her to retract what she bluntly said about Taiwan. She does not want to follow his directive explicitly, even though she softens her tone a bit. Rather than succumb to Beijing's stern demands, she expects the United States to support her in countering Beijing's pressure. Then, Marco Rubio, a figure China does not like or care about, enters. When Marco Rubio stood at the podium on December 19, reporters asked the obvious question. What's your view on rising Japan-China tensions? And do you condemn China's recent actions? It was Tokyo's moment, as many in Japan thought. Surely, Washington would speak firmly. Surely, the alliance would be front and center. Surely, China would get a verbal slap, if not on the face, on the butt at least. Instead, Rubio did signal something very different. He acknowledged tensions. He called them long-standing. He emphasized balance. And most importantly, he said this. The U.S. can maintain a strong alliance with Japan while also finding productive ways to work with China. No condemnation. No finger-pointing. No choosing sides. Just calm, careful diplomacy. And in Tokyo, that landed like a bucket of ice water. What Rubio was really saying, then? Let's be clear, Rubio didn't abandon Japan. He reaffirmed the alliance. He emphasized partnership. He didn't undermine treaty commitments. But he also made something else crystal clear. The United States is not interested in being dragged into every bilateral dispute triggered by careless language from a lady with an extremely long tongue, especially when Taiwan is involved. It wasn't America's weakness. It was its strategy. Rubio essentially said. China is powerful. China isn't going anywhere. And pretending the tension between the two East Asian countries is not part of America's foreign policy. He acknowledged the tension as a permanent condition, not a crisis requiring escalation. Chinese people hate Japan, and it is none of America's business. And that's where Japan's expectations collided with American reality. We should not mock America for its cowardice, nor pity Japan for its ignorance of America's selfishness. The U.S. knows its limits at China's doorstep. In East Asia, no one can defeat China, not the U.S., not Japan, not even the two combined. Obviously, Japan misread Washington. From Tokyo's perspective, the logic seemed simple. Japan speaks up on Taiwan, China reacts, the U.S. backs Japan, and then deterrence is strengthened. But Washington doesn't see the world in straight lines anymore. For the current U.S. administration, China is not just a rival, it's an unavoidable pillar of global politics. You don't shout at gravity. You work around it. Rubio's remarks reflected a broader shift, strategic dualism. Compete where you must. Engage where you can. Avoid locking yourself into zero-sum spirals. Japan, by contrast, briefly sounded like it wanted a megaphone moment. Washington handed it a whisper. Reports even suggest that Donald Trump warned Sanae Takaichi not to provoke Beijing, at least not before he visits China in April. Japanese news outlets read Rubio's comments very carefully, because when Washington speaks softly, it usually means something. Broadly speaking, the interpretation was consistent. Rubio avoided criticizing China. Rubio avoided siding explicitly with Japan. Rubio encouraged bilateral resolution. In other words, this row is your problem. Please manage it on your own. It's none of my business, it is none of our business. That realization triggered a wave of commentary, some analytical, some emotional. One prominent Japanese commentator summed it up bluntly. No matter how much Japan flatters the United States, it will be abandoned when it really counts. Harsh. Yes. But emotionally revealing. The Taiwan factor looms over everything. Here's the uncomfortable truth no one likes to say out loud. Taiwan is the most dangerous issue in global politics right now. Not Ukraine. Not the Middle East. Not even the South China Sea. Taiwan is the focal point of the world. And every actor involved, China, Japan, or the US, knows it. That's why Washington's arms sales to Taiwan continue quietly but consistently. That's why Beijing reacts so strongly to words, not just weapons. That's why Tokyo's language matters more than ever. One careless sentence can harden positions. One emotional remark can erase years of ambiguity. Rubio's restraint wasn't indifference, it was risk management. China and Japan have a relationship that never fully healed. To understand how fragile this situation is, we have to remember that China-Japan relations are never just about the present. They are about the past, the memory of Japan's wartime atrocities. Not only were 300,000 Chinese killed in Nanking, but also the Japanese invaders slaughtered dozens of millions in other areas of China's soil, including Taiwan. History. War. Occupation. Trauma. Every modern dispute reopens old files. When Beijing criticizes Japan, history is never far behind. When Tokyo talks about security, the past whispers loudly. That makes trust fragile and missteps costly. Despite the rhetoric, China and Japan remain deeply intertwined economically. Supply chains. Tourism. Investment. Manufacturing. When China issued travel warnings, Japan felt it immediately. Hotels, retailers, and local economies noticed. Diplomacy might be abstract, but lost tourists are not. And Washington? Washington knows that destabilizing East Asia would ripple straight through the global economy. That's another reason Rubio chose balance over bravado. What does this mean for Japan politically? Domestically, the fallout continues. Opposition parties are demanding accountability. The nuclear debate has rattled public opinion. Trust in strategic leadership has taken a hit. People are talking about her resignation. Japan is facing an uncomfortable question. How far does it really want to go? Strategic clarity sounds appealing, until it invites consequences. And Washington's message was subtle but firm. Please don't assume we'll carry the burden of your words. What does this mean for the United States? For the US, Rubio's remarks signal continuity, not confusion. Alliances matter. Stability matters more. China is a rival, but not one Washington wants to corner into escalation. The US wants influence, not explosions. And that requires patience, ambiguity, and sometimes disappointing allies. So, where does this leave us? As 2025 ends, East Asia sits in a delicate balance. Japan feels exposed. China feels challenged. The US feels cautious. No one wants war. If there's a war, it will be a proxy war, and the US wants to stay out. If Japan wants to be the proxy, it is a volunteer. The US pretends it is not pushing Tokyo to do so. Everyone wants leverage. And everyone is watching everyone else's words very, very carefully. Rubio's calm delivery masked a hard truth. In today's Asia, saying less is often more powerful than saying more. Maybe the Japanese should ask themselves whether a mentally unstable wife can manage a country like handling her own family mess. The Takaichi triggered row wasn't just about Taiwan. It wasn't just about China. And it certainly wasn't just about Rubio. It was about expectations. Japan expected applause. It got a reminder now: the lapdog should not expect every bark to deserve a meaty treat. China expected discipline. It got defiance. Why does Japan defy China? Because it thinks China did not defeat Japan in the Second World War. Americans did. So it fears America, not China. In the middle of the 7th century, the Tang Dynasty and Japan engaged in both indirect and direct conflicts, culminating in the Battle of Beijing on the Korean peninsula, where Japan suffered a total defeat with lasting impacts to this day. Will China and Japan have another fight, then bring forth peace in the next 1,000 years? The US does not expect that to happen, as if China defeats Japan as the Tang Dynasty did, Japan will side with China, and in 50 years or a century to come, the Japanese may even become a part of the Greater China Circle, like Mongols and Manchurians. That will change East Asia permanently. So the US will do something to prevent it, and let us wait for Washington's next move to keep East Asia at stake.